And we're here. Hey, Fredric Mitchell, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Jam. How's it going with you, man?
Pretty good, pretty good. Not the nicest day, but on the other hand, makes me feel better about being in the office, you know.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, same here.
You're hiding from the thunderstorms in your basement. That's what you told me
That's right.
before.
Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, for those who don't know, yes, I am in my basement. This is my impetus to actually get my basement finished. So if I force myself to work down here on cold and dreary days, it'll push me to kind of, okay, eventually get this all done. So, plus it scares my little kids, so.
So they stay out of your way.
That's right.
Well, it's good start with the IKEA curtains there, so, you know.
That's right. That's right.
So this is another session at Jam's virtual Drupal camp, and I'm really excited to have Fredric Mitchell with me. Fredric has been doing a great session at a few events, and he and I caught up at NYC camp in New York, and I love this idea, and I'm really, really excited. And I didn't have time to see it when we were in New York. So basically, for completely selfish reasons, you see, I can dedicate an hour of my day now while you do this session for me. Thank you very much for coming.
Absolutely, man. I mean, as you know, in open source and specifically with Drupal, it's all about sharing the knowledge. So I'm happy to do this at any time. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, cool. So I'd like to know a little bit more about you. Do you have a first Drupal memory?
My first Drupal memory actually was actually at Palantir. I used to work at Palantir, and back in the day at Palantir, it was just Krell and I. So my first Drupal memory was actually trying to absorb all of Larry's kind of eagerness and enthusiasm about Drupal 5 at the time, and trying to really understand, like, you know, what this is. And of course, as I opened the Pandora's box and tried to follow, you know, the direction he was going, it kind of opened my eyes and, you know, got really excited. And I've been kind of running ever since then. So,
Larry, so you and Larry were the developers at Palantir at that point?
Yeah, a long time ago when they were a lot smaller. Yeah, it had gotten to the point where, I mean, we had front-end developers, but I think at the time in terms of like the back-end stuff, yeah, it was Larry and myself, and we were just starting to really kind of accelerate into Drupal. We, at that time, had a homegrown CMS. We were supporting some other off-the-shelf stuff, but we really were kind of, you know, going in that direction, so, yeah.
Right. Larry must have been a great mentor and sort of partner in that process of discovery.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was great. Like I said, it was I have an engineering background, and I actually did a complete career transition. So I'd come from like consulting, healthcare consulting actually, and completely was like, okay, I want to do the web thing for real. So yeah, Palantir was like my first kind of, okay, shed the student ties, shed, you know, a lot of the travel, let's just kind of go and see what this is like. So yeah, Larry was great in terms of the mentoring and really kind of, again, opening my eyes to, you know, what open source was about and what Drupal was about. Absolutely.
Great. So now you are senior developer at Phase 2, and Phase 2 does a lot of cool work. Describe what you do at your day job.
Sure. So yeah, right now I'm kind of a man that wears a lot of different hats at Phase 2. So Phase 2, we specialize in, you know, using Drupal as a platform, not just kind of building a regular site. So we support a lot of different enterprise clients, nonprofit clients, government clients. And right now, my day-to-day in a job is working with developers, working with analysts, user experience folks, front-end folks, the client, and making sure the architecture meets the vision that they're looking for. So we have a lot of discovery conversations. We have a lot of strategic kind of projection conversations of what you're looking for in the middle term, the long term, you know, where Drupal is going. And then, of course, you know, if they have an existing site, most of my clients have a Drupal 7 site and they're considering Drupal 8. You know, we'll talk about, okay, what kind of architecture decisions are we making right now to kind of prepare for that. Again, kind of building tools for the various user roles, whether it's a site administrator who wants to connect disparate systems to a content creator who wants to create various campaigns within their platform. So it's kind of a little bit of everything, but I like it a lot. So
that last part certainly ties in with a conversation I had with Pam Barone from Previous Next in Australia, where she talked about designing sites with the end user in mind, but then she immediately pointed out that the end user is not only the potential customer, people you want to sell things to, people who go to your site, but the end user, the other end user, maybe the more important end user for her is the content editor and creator, and the person who has to live inside the guts of the thing every day and trying to make their working experience, a pleasant one, and not just what got thrown together, or in the world of proprietary where she worked before as a content editor, if you needed to make a change to the back-end interface for the CMS, it would either cost tens of thousands of dollars or it wasn't even possible. So
right.
Yeah, so
yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, so it just I had this realization actually that when we were talking, that there's the end user is not the end user. You have all those different people that you're working for, as you were just describing.
Yeah, I mean, exactly, and the key is, what is going to reap the maximum value at that time. If the focus of the organization, right, is their outwardly facing audience, whether it's a customer to someone you want to actually do some sort of interaction. So in the case of a nonprofit, if you're looking for people to donate or engage or volunteer, right, the maximum amount of value is, okay, what are you projecting to that audience? While as the other case, in that same nonprofit scenario, you may have more business value because that message is already tailored. People already know that brand already. There may be more value in actually building tools for an internal team for them to be able to manipulate and do certain things to meet that audience. So they may have something in meat space already, right, that engages their donors or their grantees, but they're looking for a set of tools within their Drupal system or some other systems that connect to their Drupal site to again facilitate those interactions that they already kind of know the direction they want. For example, microsite building to campaign building to creating some sort of really personalized and niche interaction where after someone donates, they can immediately share or bring in other people to kind of relive and enjoy the experience that they're doing. So it's pretty cool. Like I said, it's very challenging. Again, mainly because you have to be that interpretation between, okay, what they're looking for and what is technically possible, and then of course, what fits in the budget at that time. So,
so phase 2 does a lot of work with around like DC work, right? Government,
right.
NGO, nonprofits, that kind of thing. How is it?
Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Hey, no problem. So I was wondering. So you have this. How is it bringing open source to these kind of clients nowadays?
It's great, actually. I mean, we were part of the original kind of WhiteHouse.gov build and the We the People petition system that they use to kind of get the kind of democratization of ideas and get that whole thing. So that really, at least I personally feel, it opened up this conversation of what open source was, the security of open source, and what it really meant in terms of democratic principles. And of course, in the land of politics, perception is important. So it's been actually great. I actually was the lead developer at one point on the energy.gov project. So that was one of the first Drupal 7 sites that started 2 or 3 years ago. And what that ended up actually being was, it fit all of the kind of political checkboxes. One, it was going to save money. 2, it brought, various offices under the Department of Energy under the same kind of branding. 3, they didn't have kind of the recurring licenses. And then 4, because it was open source and because we could manipulate it, we could custom tailor, again, those content authoring, experiences and those tools to the needs of the various offices while still having that kind of super administrator and allowing that person to kind of control, what needed to be controlled, whether it's moving something from PDF into actual web documents to, workflow of various press releases to even, helping bubble up certain ideas depending upon a campaign. So we've had a lot of information about the loans the Department of Energy gave to Tesla, to the Yucca Mountain stuff, to all these other things, and being able to have basically being able to enable government officials to help them get their message out, and so people can figure out, okay, what is going on, what were the details of those pieces of interactions of those events. It's a public service. So from my experience, and again, we're continuing to work with the Senate, we're working with the House of Representatives. It's been absolutely great because everyone kind of understands at this point in 2014 that open, transparency, open source, democratization, they all kind of have a single kind of underlying thread. So,
all right, it's nice to see that there is an acknowledgement of our values and practices in open source, the belief in and the putting into practice of transparency, right, and of some sort of meritocracy. And you're free to use study, modify, share. It really empowers us a lot, and it's great to hear that people have really taken that on board. Can you talk about the priorities or the special needs that a government client might have, especially if they're different perhaps from what someone who's used to dealing with other sorts of enterprise businesses or what have you? What's different about doing government work?
I would say the only difference really is just kind of knowing your audience. A lot of times, again, because various offices have budgets, various offices have different stakeholders, you really want to kind of understand the impact of the various audiences that can go into who's going to be using the tool. So that could be from the various experience levels regarding technology and being able to adapt or update specific content, to, again, kind of understanding, okay, what is going to be the biggest amount of value for what this particular office is looking for. In certain examples, again, as I was saying, like the Department of Energy had a lot of different offices, so there was a lot of conversation about, okay, so 100 so offices have 100 different budgets when it comes to their web technology, and we're trying to standardize that in terms of a branding and in terms of a single platform. That specific challenge, specifically with government, was, okay, we know that this is going to be a long process, right? Because there's going to have to be conversations. There needs to be a lot of room for questions, of answering. There's going to be a pilot program. There's going to be some opportunities where we can have some discussions to defend some of our decisions, also being very open. And so that's a little bit different than, a nonprofit or corporate entity where it may be kind of a top-down approach where, because a specific timeline or an event or a budget is driving decisions, and so a board gets together and they decide, okay, this is what we're going to do, and we need to have it done by this time because this is this other thing that's part of that. That kind of long, again, kind of democratized discussion of, okay, this office is going to do this, we're going to pilot this, we're going to get everyone's feedback of what this is actually going to be, and then we're going to share those results, and then people are going to be able to see, like, okay, this worked, this didn't work, how do we change, how do we pivot, etc. It's really unique about doing government projects. But again, from my perspective, I feel like that's kind of what it's about. It's a constantly evolving and changing thing, and the fact that you start with an open source system like Drupal just kind of feeds right into what it's all about, which is, to your point, right, you fork, you modify, you share, and then you just kind of move on from there and continue to improve. So.
Okay, so the government working culture to some extent reflects this sort of working processes and evolution that we go through within our open source projects. That's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's right. There's pros and cons to that, right? Because a lot of times, certain people feel like it may not be moving fast enough, right? You hear that kind of old adage, "When is Drupal whatever going to be ready?" And Larry famously says, "When it's ready," and it's kind of the same thing, right? You want it to be right. You want people to feel like they can contribute, but you also want to make progress in kind of incremental steps. And sometimes you kind of take big leaps to get a good pilot process out there, so people can kind of pick it apart, touch it, and play with it, and manipulate it. And other pieces, we just set, a goal and we just continuously improve it and keep adding pieces to it. Absolutely.
So last two questions, I think.
Sure.
What are you most excited about in Drupal 8?
To be quite honest, I'm again, my background's in engineering, so I'm more about the kind of nuts and bolts pieces, but I'm really excited about, the integration with Symfony. I've been following a lot of the conversation that was talked about going in this direction. I think I've learned a lot. I mean, when you jump into other languages, whether it's Ruby or Python or, Java or what have you, the object-oriented principles, how packages are included, the namespacing, all the different stuff, those have existed for a while. The fact that now, this framework and the CMS that I enjoy so much is going to be using that a lot more, for me, kind of makes it a lot easier for me to jump, and it's a lot more efficient learning. So I'm really excited to kind of translate, what I've learned in terms of the Drupal way and, the different principles of PHP, where PHP is going in 5.5, 5.6, etc., and actually seeing those manifestations again in something as popular and as powerful as Drupal, because I feel like that's just going to make me, a better, engineer. So
I love learning efficiency is a I'm not sure I've heard that term specifically before, but I think learning efficiency is all over Drupal 8. The unification of the internal systems and base classes, and there are more layers to the system, right? But once you understand how everything works, there is there are many fewer ways to do things, because all the internal CRUD operations are the same across the systems and so on. So I think actually I've been talking to a bunch of people who said, what was it, Brant Wynn in Chicago said oh, to learn Drupal 7 really well, I had to take a weekend for each internal system and study it. And then I got on top of that, and then when I needed to know another one, then I would spend the next weekend doing that. And he said, I spent maybe a 3-day weekend looking at Drupal 8 internals, but now I feel I know 80–90% of the system, and all I need to do is learn the special flavor of the particular subsystem. It's what it does, what its specialty is.
Right, exactly, and I think that's the point, right? We want to, not invent the wheel every time we do an upgrade, every time we do a particular system. I think, again, going back to, Larry's point, the Pi philosophy probably invented elsewhere, and that's really cool. I mean, the whole thing, again, inside the PHP community of Packagist and Composer, borrowing libraries. I mean, that's what's done in Ruby. That's what's done in Python. That's what's done in Java. I mean, there's just these commonalities are there in terms of using packages, having a package manager, and being able to use those namespaces when you need them. That's just how it's done, and it makes a lot of sense for us to kind of not jump on the bandwagon, but align ourselves in those interests, because now we can cross-learn. And again, like I said, the learning efficiency. And to be quite honest, that's exactly what my presentation's about. Is okay, how do you take what you knew from Drupal 7? Here's some things, and here's the new hotness, and some of these functions are now called this. So
okay, awesome. So what word best describes Drupal?
Open.
That is a good answer. Now, for those of you listening to the Acquia podcast, the podcast is going to wind down now. Thank you, Fredric Mitchell, for taking the time to talk with me today.
Absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity.
And if you want to see and hear Fredric's session, go on over to acquia.com/podcasts, find the page for this podcast, and embedded on that page you will find his full session and his slides embedded or linked as well. So come on over and check that out. Thanks for listening to the podcast, and see you soon for the live version and for everyone else. This is Jam's Virtual Drupal Camp. I'm with Fredric Mitchell from Phase 2, and Fredric is about to do his session that I was not able to see at NYC Camp. 30 super awesome, what was it, Drupal 8?
Awesome Drupal 8 API functions, yeah.
That you should already know.
That's right, absolutely. All right.
Okay, so Fred, I am going to hand it over to you and your slides, and if anybody wants to ask any questions in the live session, the Q&A app is open on the Google Hangout page, and we will get to those questions by the end.
Okay, sounds great. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, how are we looking?
Looks great. Go for it.
So as Jam, thanks Jam, I appreciate it. And as he said, the title of this is called 30 Awesome Drupal 8 API Functions You Should Already Know. And again, as Jam had said, I gave this presentation at NYC Camp this past year, and I'll actually be giving this presentation at DrupalCon Austin as well. So if you want to kind of talk to me about it, or if you have some critiques, I'm definitely open to that. So, all right. So assumptions. So the assumptions that I'm making regarding this particular presentation is that you actually want to see some code. So I will be showing some code snippets. Again, my title, as I was saying, is I'm a senior developer, so I'm all about the code. I'm hoping that you've written something custom, you know, and you're familiar with the PHP isms, custom modules, etc. I'll just kind of assume that knowledge. I'm also hoping that you like APIs. You know, I'm all about, you know, being able to connect disparate systems via some sort of API. And, you know, some of the things we'll be talking about will revolve around that as well. One of the other things that I'm assuming is that you understand the concept, or you're open to the idea that Drupal is not only a content management system, but it's also a framework, right? It provides this very robust core API library where you can essentially, you know, jump into as much of the framework as you need to, or you can, you know, build tools for various folks, as we talked about earlier, in those specific contexts. And then fifth, the other assumption I'm making, and the quick link to it, but basically KDS stands for Keeping Drupal Simple. And it's essentially a philosophy of, again, starting with the API, starting with the core functions, trying to stay within core as much as you possibly can to achieve as much as you need, and to basically build as needed. So if you want to kind of jump into that, I talk about Pattern Lab a bit, if you guys are familiar with Pattern Lab and component building versus kind of web page building and how that fits into the Drupal philosophy. You can definitely take a look at that. All right, again, quickly, I'm a senior developer at Phase 2 Technology. My passions, again, are kind of Drupal, the dry and kiss principle. So these are kind of programming principles. Don't repeat yourself, and then kind of keep it simple, stupid. I'm really big into strategic communication. One of the things that I do every day is really kind of understand and pull out of various colleagues, you know, what the value is, the direction we're going. And then, of course, I also like graphic novels. I mean, who doesn't like graphic novels? Graphic novels are awesome. All right, before we start, a quick disclaimer. So even though the title in this case was API functions, in D7, API functions meant, right, common procedural functions. In Drupal 8, the term API functions will probably be, or will actually mean in this case, common class methods. So, you know, I'll go into this a little bit more, but in most cases, or in some cases, the procedural methods or procedural functions that we'll talk about are actually just wrappers around methods in specific classes. And then we'll kind of talk again about how it exists then, or, you know, and then being the D7 way, and how it exists now for Drupal 8. One quick additional disclaimer is that this presentation, as you guys know, Drupal 8 is in alpha right now. So the specific functions and the specific methods I'm pulling out and the specific classes I'm calling out are based off of, again, a little bit of research I've done inside the changelog in terms of the discussions as of March 25th. There's a lot of functions I'm going to go over, as you saw, 30 functions. So I'm planning to kind of go back through this again once some of these discussions have kind of progressed, but just kind of like letting you know. So things will probably change, but that's okay. We're going to roll with the punches and kind of keep it going, and hopefully this presentation will, again, give you that kind of quick, you know, quick start that you need to think about what you need to do for Drupal 8. All right, so let's jump right into it. So let's talk about strings, right? So strings are just a matter of printing stuff. And what are our really awesome functions that we use? So in Drupal 8, you have a method called checkPlain. And checkPlain is essentially a static method inside of the string class. In D7, the function was actually check underscore plain, and when you use this function, all you were essentially doing was essentially calling the PHP HTML special characters function. So in Drupal 8, it's very similar. You just don't have the check underscore. It's basically check plain, and then you call it, just like you would any other kind of static method. The same is true for Drupal underscore placeholder. So if you guys remember, Drupal underscore placeholder is basically a wrapper around check plain, and it adds the kind of italicized HTML tag, the EM tag, around whatever text that you're doing. So instead of the Drupal underscore placeholder procedural function, you're pretty much going to use the placeholder method inside, static method inside the string class. So what does this look like? So again, the T function is still there. As I'm sure you guys are probably breathing a sigh of relief. The T function is still there. You can still use that again to translate your text, and then of course using your specific placeholder swap, whether it's an @ symbol, a modulus symbol, or an exclamation point, you can still use that to do your sanitization. And of course, as you guys probably know, the @ symbol again invokes the check plain method. If you use the modulus symbol, you're using the placeholder method, and if you use the exclamation symbol in your placeholders, then you'll be basically printing it out as it is. The L function is still there. Again, we're still in kind of the strings umbrella. L function is still there. You would use it just like you would in Drupal 7, so that's pretty cool. You can pass in your text. You can pass in URL. You can add specific options to the third parameter in the array, and it works just like it does in D7. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so we talked quickly about strings. We just briefly went into this whole, again, idea of, okay, so we went from procedural underscore functions to some quick static methods. That's not too hard. I think strings is again, one of those things that didn't really get too much of a forklift there. So let's kind of get into rendering. In Drupal 7, as you guys probably know, rendering was this concept that basically you give it an array of things, and it basically printed out what you needed when it eventually went to the theme layer and was shown to the user, right? So rendering is making stuff pretty. So in Drupal 7, as in Drupal 8, you actually are going to use your Drupal underscore render function, right? And Drupal underscore render is one of those things that I think can probably use a lot more documentation, a lot more blog posts, and I probably should do some more about it. But essentially, again, the idea is instead of in your custom module, hard coding HTML in your return functions, you basically can just build an array of the markup you're looking for, whether you're actually defining the markup using the hash markup tag inside your array, to actually invoking a theme function using the hash theme function, and then calling Drupal render directly. I think the one big caveat for D8 though is that Drupal render is everything. Drupal underscore render is everything. So whereas in D7 you would actually, call a theme function manually, so you'd have theme, and then the first property or the first parameter inside the theme function was the string of the theme function you're looking for. So if it was a table theme function, so theme underscore table would be theme, then the first string function was table, and then you'd pass in the properties. Theme is essentially gone in D8. So right now, underscore theme is like this internal function that they're using until that I feel like it's going to completely be excised from core. So in Drupal 8, you're going to want to basically build everything as a render array. So again, quick code example. So in D7, if we were building a theme, basically outputting a table, right? We would call the theme function directly. Again, we would pass in that string of table, and then we would pass in an array of options specifically to the table theme. So we'd have a header option, we'd have a rows option, and then we'd add some attributes, whether it was a class or an ID for that particular HTML. Then if you want to add a pager, right, we would just append a pager by calling theme pager. Taking that exact same example in D8, right, in this case you'll notice that instead of theme, we actually have this new property inside of our Drupal render array, which is hash type. And so in hash type, you would say hash type, okay, the type in this case is table. The header is, and so instead of options, you actually specify for this particular render array hash header, and then you pass in your header values, your hash rows, you pass in your rows value. The same attributes are still there, and then you call Drupal render. If you want to add a pager to that specific markup, kind of the same thing. You have hash theme, then you pass in the type of theme you want, theme function you want, in this case pager, and then you call your Drupal render, and now you have your pager appended to your markup. So instead of, again, the theme function is completely gone, and you basically essentially want to use Drupal render all the way. All right, so now we're getting into kind of like the core meaty stuff, right? Nodes. And nodes, as you guys know, is what stores content. That's pretty much kind of the main mechanism that content creators use when they're working with Drupal as a CMS. So wait, hold on a second. Okay, so in Drupal 7 we had this concept of entities, and now entity was like the basic building block, right? Because in Drupal 6 nodes was the basic building block, but now in Drupal 7 entity was the basic building block, and everything's entity, users are entities, etc. So why are we talking about nodes, right? Everything is entity now, right? Why are we even talking about all the specific node stuff? Because in Drupal 8 it's even more abstracted, and entity is the holy grail, right? And you're right, I was getting there, so bear with me for a second. All right, so again, from a conceptual standpoint, right, we have the D7 procedural function of node load multiple. In D8, you're actually going to want to use entity load multiple to load a specific set of nodes, right? So what's interesting about entity load multiple is that even though as of right now you could still use node load multiple in D8, if you actually look at that function, all it's doing is invoking entity load multiple. So you might as well use that. But even if you use entity load multiple, right, we're still in kind of this procedural land of, okay, should I use methods? Which class should I invoke, etc. So if I use entity load multiple, and that's, we can still use that, what is that actually doing? It actually wraps around the load multiple method inside of the controller class that's being invoked. So since we're kind of in the nodes umbrella, that specific controller class is the default controller class. In this case, it's the storage controller class, right? So a storage controller is defined for an entity. In this case, the entity type is node. So it's calling the load multiple method inside of the storage controller class, which is the default storage controller for the entity type of node. And then the default storage controller for that specific entity type is actually using whatever the default database storage controller class is, right? So if you're kind of out of the box using Drupal, right, and you're messing with nodes, you're going to essentially, if you use the entity load multiple procedural wrapper, this is how it kind of drills down. So again, a quick kind of code example is, all right, I want to load a whole bunch of nodes quickly. I use entity load multiple. I pass in the string of entity type that I'm looking for, and then I pass in the IDs specifically, right? And this is pretty cool because it caches it for you, so if you invoke it multiple times, you shouldn't necessarily see a performance hit. All right, so let's talk about entity view multiple, right? That the same kind of principle applies. So in D7, when you use node view multiple, you could pass in, right, a whole bunch of different nodes. In this case, this is pretty cool because now you can programmatically, right, get yourself a render array of many nodes. So if you go back to that Drupal_render that we talked about earlier, now you can kind of set up your data for Drupal_render. So again, node view multiple, as of right now in D8, again, just invokes entity view multiple. Entity view multiple, as I said before, is just a procedural wrapper that invokes a view multiple method inside the render controller class. And again, this is important to kind of understand because the one kind of main advantage and kind of awesome hotness with Drupal 8 is the fact that because these things are methods inside of classes, and these classes are invoking kind of a default implementation, right? They're being instantiated in a default way. When you need to change those assumptions, right, as we all know that you're not supposed to hack core, you can, though, redirect core. You can basically define a new controller, a new storage controller, a new render controller. You can define your own controller classes and basically redirect the execution of core without actually having to touch core. And this is actually really powerful because now, whether you have a different database backend to a different rendering front end to any other kind of need any other kind of specification that you need for that particular context, this makes it really, really cool. So again, kind of jumping down into this a little bit more, right? The default render controller is using the Get View Builder class for that specific entity, and again, the entity we're talking about is nodes. And then the default View Builder controller is likely going to be instantiating the entity View Builder class. And again, these things are important to know because if you ever need to, again, redirect the assumptions that are based in these classes that are being instantiated or are being called. Knowing how the procedural functions are kind of wrapping around the specific methods is important. So again, the way you do this, you just pass in, your a whole bunch of array of entity objects and call entity view multiple. All right, moving on. So we're still in the nodes kind of umbrella of discussion. So node save is gone, right? So in this case, we want to use the kind of default entity procedural function. So in this case, you can use entity create. And this, again, you can use it to save a node to a database. And as I said before, entity create, again, is just a procedural function that wraps around a method inside of a class. So again, going back to that kind of default controller that's going to be used for nodes out of the box, and nodes is the kind of one of the default entities inside of D8. It's basically invoking the create method, the default, again, storage controller for the entity, and then the database storage controller is the default storage controller for that specific entity. So if you want to create a node programmatically, you would call entity create, you'd pass in the entity type, and then of course you can pass in another array of options specifically to the entity, which I think is actually pretty cool. You can do some really cool things there. And then of course just invoke the save method on that entity that's created at that point. Cool? Cool. All right. Let's talk about menus. One of the things I do a lot of times, especially if you've ever had to create a menu programmatically or show a menu programmatically or manipulate the details inside of a menu depending upon a specific user type or role or a specific context, right? Menus are the thing that allows you to kind of navigate to content, right? It registers paths. All right, so in D7 you use hook underscore menu. In D8 you don't use that anymore, it's gone, right? So in this kind of quick code example, you can see that in my module file I had a hook underscore menu, and then in hook underscore menu I defined a path as a key in an array, and then inside that array I would define a page callback which would invoke a procedural function which says, okay, if someone goes to abc/def, return whatever this function does. In D8 you're actually going to use what's called a YAML file, and in this case a routing.yaml file. Now what's really cool about YAML files and just the whole concept of static configuration files is, again, this is kind of aligning with some best practices that exist along, again, this full stack spectrum. If you've ever done some kind of local development with Vagrant and Puppet, you'll know that one of the things that Puppet 3 is using right now is a higher YAML file, and essentially what that does is it's just setting configuration parameters for a system to build with. And we're kind of taking that philosophy, or at least using that philosophy inside of Drupal 8 to do the same thing. Because at the end of the day, when you're defining paths, right, it's essentially just configuration. So instead of having that configuration in some sort of procedural, little bit of a fog, we're going to, again, use that common thread that is used in other instances of kind of, again, the full stack methodology, and use the YAML file, in this case a routing YAML file, to define configuration for a route. So if contrasting D7 and D8, right, you set your path in your routing YAML file, and then you basically define, again, which specific method in your specific controller is going to be invoked when that route is seen. And then of course you can set different permissions, other requirements, etc. All right, another cool thing that that D8 is doing is that it's putting a lot of things inside of a request attribute, and basically this is taking the place of menu get item. And if you've ever used menu get item to kind of get the details of a specific router item, in this case you're going to use a request attribute, and the request attribute is actually can be invoked once you invoke the request method inside of the kind of global Drupal class. It's just a static method. So right now, if you want to get information about a particular request object, this is kind of, again, piggybacking off of the new routing system from Symfony. You would essentially just instantiate the kind of global Drupal class statically via that request method, and then inside that attributes inside of request, you can grab that object. And the same is kind of true for menu get object, right? So menu get object was, as we all kind of know, best practices to figure out what node am I on, or what entity am I on, or what object am I on. Menu get object is gone in Drupal 8. So to get the details of what's going on inside of a particular object based on the route that you're on, you can essentially jump into, again, the details inside that are returned from the request method from the global Drupal object. So in this particular example, right, I'm just basically getting the node as part of the attributes inside of what's returned of the request method that's part, again, of that globally called Drupal object. Now, I will kind of caveat that this is something that's currently being discussed, right? We talked about Drupal 8 being an alpha. So if you want to kind of follow that discussion, as of right now, I just checked it this morning. There's some child issues that have kind of spawned from this, and this is probably going to be cleaned up a little bit. And you can definitely kind of follow that as you need to. All right, so continue along again, the menu methodology. Menu tree page data is still there in Drupal 8 as from what I've seen. So this is a really cool way to kind of get the information from a menu tree based off of a machine name. So you can still use that, which is awesome. If you want to, again, kind of set a menu up, if you want to print it out programmatically, you can still use menu tree output. So if you kind of chain the two procedural functions together, you get the data of a specific menu based off a machine name. Then you pass in that tree and the level of tree that you want into menu tree output, and now you essentially have a render array of that specific menu. And that's how it exists in D7, and how it's going to exist in D8 as of right now. And then you can pass it into Drupal render, just like anything else. So that's pretty cool. All right, so let's kind of jump into taxonomy, right? Taxonomy is how you kind of organize your data a bit. Taxonomy is its own entity, right? You can categorize content, you can categorize data, you can basically attach some sort of organizational meta to the entity that you're looking for via some sort of field. So programmatically in D7, there was this really, really cool long name called taxonomy vocabulary machine name load. Right? And what that basically did was you could take the machine name of a piece of taxonomy, throw it into that function, and it would give you that vocabulary object back. In D8, again, we want to streamline this, right? Instead of having a kind of custom call out for taxonomy, since taxonomy is an entity, and we've already talked about, you know, entity create, entity load multiple for nodes, why wouldn't we use the same type of functions for taxonomy? And we would. So the difference is that instead of passing the entity type of node in terms of this first parameter, the string of node, you pass in taxonomy underscore vocabulary. So if you want to load a vocabulary programmatically, you'd call the same kind of entity load method, right? And we kind of talked about what entity load does and what it wraps around. You can, again, kind of get that vocabulary object as you need it. Taxonomy get tree is still there. So if you still want to kind of programmatically create a hierarchical structure of taxonomy terms, you can still use taxonomy get tree once you have your vocabulary object loaded. And again, this quick example kind of goes through all the terms and kind of builds an options array if you need to do that. So that's still there, which is great. Cool. All right, so we talked about strings, we talked about menus, we talked about nodes and content, we talked about taxonomy. Right, let's talk about, right, the other really, really, really important part, which kind of, I think, you know, where the rubber meets the road in terms of what Drupal is really known for, which is making things fieldable, right? Fields are a way to not only organize content, right, you can associate taxonomy to it, but it now becomes this pivot point of how the data is architected, right? When you create a field on something, whether it's a user, taxonomy, node, or any kind of entity, right, you now are not only giving the user this power to, you know, organize their content as it relates to that specific entity, but you're also doing some data architecture behind the scenes of the relationships between, you know, the various tables that are created at this point. In D7, there is a really cool kind of procedural function called field info field. In D8, we basically have a get field method. And the get field method, again, is kind of buried inside of that kind of global Drupal class that you can call. And inside this, the field info method, again, is a static method you can invoke from the Drupal, as I said, the Drupal global namespace, and there's a field class inside of there. So if you want to get the specific information of a specific field, you would invoke the get field method after getting the field info, right? And you would basically get all the details of that specific field. So if you didn't want to manipulate that field later, delete it, update it, etc., you now have kind of all the pieces you need for that specific field. The one thing I would note is that this specific method does eventually invoke entity load. So if we go back to what we talked about before of, okay, kind of streamlining all of the pieces that are invoked regardless of the entity type that you're using, in this case, fields have essentially two entity types that are attached to them, either the field configuration or the instance configuration of that field. Speak of the devil, here we go. So if you want to get the information about a specific instance, right? So again, kind of quickly recapping, the information about a field is kind of the basic information of how a field is going to be structured, right? Is it a text list type of field? What is the configuration of that field? Because it can be reused in other places. The instance of a field is where that field is actually being used, right? So if you have a list text field that is used at a node and used at a user, the configuration is the fact that it's a text list. The instance is, okay, what is it? How is it being used on the node part? Then you have a separate instance of how it's being used on the user part. So if you want to get information about a specific instance, you first have to get the field info, and again, you can kind of invoke that from, again, the global Drupal namespace of the Drupal object, and then you can call the get instance method once you kind of get that field info object and pass in your entity type, your bundle type, and then of course your field name specifically, which is really cool. And again, going back to this kind of common theme, as you guys are probably noticing, that this specific method is just a wrapper around any load multiple, which again kind of goes back down into that whole, okay, it wraps around, you know, the controller, it wraps around the storage controller, which wraps around the database controller. In this case, again, the entity type for instances is the instance configuration. So it's field underscore instance underscore config as an entity type for fields. So if you want to create a field, right, again, why would we have a custom function just for creating fields? We can reuse this entity layer that we already have, and we can invoke, right, the entity create method, which again, if you think back to what I was just talking about in terms of the entity types that kind of power fields, right, we have the field configuration, which again is kind of the base portion, then you have the instance configuration. So if you want to create a field, you can simply just, again, call entity create, which again is going to be a wrapper around you know, a specific method inside the storage controller, and then you're just basically going to load the entity type of field underscore config along with the values you would like to create programmatically of a field. So in this case, instead of, whereas we used a node, we had a default storage controller for field configuration, there's a default field configuration storage controller, which again kind of jumps into the default database storage controller, and all the other methods that are going to be invoked when you're creating a field that you want to use when you're manipulating a field or setting the various properties. I definitely would encourage you to kind of look inside of the field config class that's kind of, again, in this Drupal global namespace. There's a lot of really cool stuff in there. So again, quick kind of code example. So in D7, if you guys are familiar with features, right, if you ever exported a feature and exported a field, you'd get this really giant, big array of things. It would give you all the details of a specific field, right? So whether it was active, what was the cardinality, what type it was, what were the filters that were allowed in that specific type, whether it was translatable, etc. And then you would pass all of this giant array into the field create field method, or field create field function, I should say. In D8, you can make that a lot simpler, right? You can basically just create a field configuration entity using the entity create method or entity create function, pass in your array of details that you need, and then just invoke the save method. That's so much cleaner. And that's really cool because if you start, again, thinking about, okay, what can I do programmatically just with core in terms of creating fields, in terms of updating specific field types, right? Depending upon your user context, if you have a user that, you know, is not going to be jumping into all of the different buttons inside of Drupal, right? Because as we know, Drupal has a ton of configuration options. And they just want this kind of a la carte, white glove, kind of, okay, I want to submit a ticket, or I want to create a request, and I want these things to just appear before me, right? Being able to do that programmatically and set that in update hooks kind of fits into the mechanism of a multi-team or a multi-developer team that you can see the progress of how things have changed, right? You can create fields programmatically, you can update fields programmatically, you can delete things, you can move things around, you can change the weight of things that they appear for your various user experiences when they're creating content. Being able to do this simply, programmatically in D8 is going to be really awesome. The same is true for creating instances, right? Programmatically, same kind of thing. So we'll kind of jump through this a little bit quickly. But in this case, again, the entity type is field instance config. And it's the same kind of deal. You use entity create to create your field instance. And in this case, it's invoking, or it's using the field instance, or instantiating, I should say, sorry, the field instance config storage controller. And again, if you want to kind of see all the other methods that are inside the field instance config class, I definitely encourage you to take a look at that, because you can do all these cool things, whether it's creating a field, to updating a field, to changing specific parts of the instance for that specific field. There are methods that will help you do that versus having to know the giant array. So again, if we look at that kind of giant array, right, you kind of have to know what bundle is there already, what the entity type, the field name, etc., and then you pass it into field create instance in D7. In D8, it's a lot simpler, it's a lot smoother, it's a lot, you know, a lot more easier to kind of understand. And especially when you're thinking about a project that's going to evolve over a long period of time, where multiple developers are going to jump in and jump out, having these kind of palatable ways to create fields is going to definitely, you know, save some time in understanding, you know, what happened, what do I need to change. The other cool bonus thing, and I haven't made a D8 version of this yet, is that you could probably create your own method or set of classes or even function to kind of do this automatically. So if you want to pass in, you know, a specific field definition and kind of do it on the fly, you could use something like this. So we need to kind of build that for D8 at some point, once D8 gets into beta and kind of locks down. All right, so continuing along the lines of fields, and this is probably the last slide regarding fields, is actually updating fields, right? So in D7, you had separate procedural functions for updating fields depending upon what you're trying to do. Whether you're trying to update the field base or whether you're trying to update the instance, you would have to know to call field update field or field update instance. In Drupal 8, you're just calling the save method, right? You load the entity, you manipulate it as you need to, and then you save it. That's it. So you can see in this example, right, I want to change the cardinality of a specific field from maybe 1 to 2. I load the field using, again, those field info, the entity load functions that I showed you earlier. I change the property that I need to inside the field object. I invoke save. I want to delete the field. I load the field, whether it's the configuration of the instance, and then I call the delete method. Same kind of methodology. You don't have to go through this whole kind of piece of, you know, some of the hoops that you need to jump through in order to kind of load the entire field configuration as you did in 777. Which I think, again, streamlining is good. Learning efficiency is good. The fact that you can learn these things a lot faster, I think, is good for everyone. All right, so let's talk about alters, right? Alters are this thing, as you guys know, that basically allows you to change the assumptions inside Drupal. Right, Drupal is using, especially Drupal 7 is using this kind of aspect-oriented, you know, philosophy where instead of an object-oriented philosophy where you basically inherit certain child classes, you basically have this horizontal kind of invocation method of, okay, I'm going to do some things, and now I'm going to kind of call out horizontally, does anyone want to change these assumptions before I continue my execution? In Drupal 7, you had Drupal_alter. That's gone in Drupal 8. In this case, you just want to call an alter method, and the alter method is part of as a static method inside of the module handler class. And the module handler class again or module handler, module handler class can be instantiated from the Drupal global object. So you can essentially call it as you see here. So if you want to set up some data and actually allow it to be altered later down the pipe, you can basically just pass in your data to your alter method. Hook form alter is still there. So if you do want to kind of programmatically change the assumptions of a particular form, you can still do that, so that's pretty cool. Hook form, form ID alter, as you all kind of know, is probably a better practice. Instead of having a generalized form alter, you probably want to specifically target that form using the form ID. That is still there. I think the one cool thing though is that you know, in Drupal 8, the way to get the form ID is actually a little bit easier, right? So in Drupal 7, the way that I typically do it, and this, you know, no one told me any different way to do it, is that if I want to alter a form, I first had to go to the form as it's rendered in the web. So I have to find that form somewhere. Then I basically right-click inside that form, inspect the DOM element in Firefox or Chrome. Then on the form element inside of HTML, right, there's an ID of that form. And that's how I know what the form ID was. So I knew which form ID to use in my alter. Well, in Drupal 8, there's a get form ID method, and that actually defines the ID. So now when you want to alter a form, you can actually just look at what's returned and get form ID and quickly be able to alter that form. So if we have a quick example of kind of building a form inside of Drupal 8, right, you invoke the namespace, the form namespace, you define your own namespace for the specific form, you extend a form base parent class, and then you basically call a get form ID method. And this method, again, will return basically a string of the form ID of the form you're trying to build, which now allows anyone who wants to alter your form, they can do that right there inside of the class itself, which I think is really cool. And then, of course, you would do your form ID alters just like you would anywhere else. And if you want to kind of really learn more about the current structure of the Form API, I definitely encourage you to take a look at that discussion at that point regarding the Form API. All right, hooks. Again, another kind of part of aspect-oriented kind of programming, engaging other processes, right? Instead of module invoke underscore all, you have the invoke all static method, which again can be called from the global Drupal namespace. And you just use invoke all just like you would module invoke all, pass in your hook, etc. Module underscore implement. So if you want to check to see if a module actually implements a specific hook, in Drupal 8, it's get implementations as part of the module handler class. So it's a static method inside the module handler class, and you can just pass that in like you would anything else. URLs, right? Okay, so we talked about paths. We talked about, again, kind of this horizontal invocation with hooks and alters. Now we want to talk about, okay, if something is passed in via the URL, right, kind of thinking along the REST philosophy, or even just kind of the way you would pass data back and forth at the request object. You know, there are some helper functions there to kind of grab that information for you. In D7, it was Drupal get query parameters to process a URL query. In Drupal 8, again, there's these helper methods. There's a filter query parameters method that's in part of the URL helper class. It's a static method, and you can just do it that way. So in this case, right, you would query, again, going back to that request object, you would query all the information that's inside the request object, and then based on what was passed back of that URL, you could then filter those query parameters, and then you'll get a nice, really cool array of all the query parameters kind of broken out, which really helps, especially, again, if you're passing things back and forth between either different page calls or, you know, you want to show things based on what exists in a particular URL. A really cool example that I use all the time is, okay, you know, if one role is supposed to see something versus another role versus some other particular role or some other context, you know, instead of building separate pages or separate callbacks for each one of those, you can build one callback and then basically pass in various URL parameters to show and hide different things as you need. Oops. Paths. All right, where am I? Where am I inside of kind of, you know, when I'm doing things programmatically? Right, Drupal get path is still there, right? So if you want to load some custom JS or CSS file, whatever, you can still do that. Whether it's a theme file or module file, you can still do that inside of Drupal 8, which is great. If you want to load the specific user, global user is gone. In Drupal 8, you want to invoke the current user method, a static method inside of, again, the global Drupal namespace. So global user is gone, so you don't want to use that anymore. And if you want to see more information of how to do that, definitely check out that. It's a pretty simple example of how to kind of do it. So again, if I want to load the current account, I just call current user static method on the Drupal object. I check it, and I do what I need to do. The one caveat there you'll notice is that account is not an actual user object, but a user session object, and it eventually extends the account interface class. Want to load and include file. Module load include is gone. Instead, you want to use the load include method from the module handler class. And again, that's part of the Drupal, kind of global Drupal namespace. Really straightforward. Querying. All right, so hopefully all of you know that when you query entities inside of Drupal, especially for Drupal 7, you shouldn't be doing, right, direct queries to the tables and doing all those joins. You should be using, right, entity field query. Entity field query has now been simplified into entity query. Again, and this is a method that's part of the kind of global Drupal namespace. And this is really cool to kind of search a single entity. So instead of entity field query like you would in D7, where you would create a new entity field query object and then basically pass in a whole bunch of different conditions based on methods that would take in different properties, right? So if you wanted an article node that was published, this is how you do it in D7. And if you want to know more information, if you're not using entity field query, you can definitely check out my presentation that I did of top 10 reasons of why to use entity field query. If you're not already doing so, I highly, 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 highly recommend you look at that if you don't. But in D8, very similar, but instead of having specific methods, for entity condition or properties, you're just basically setting conditions. So you would invoke or instantiate an entity query via the entity query method, pass in the entity type you're looking for, pass in your different conditions, just like anything else, and then you have your query. Very similar, but a little bit different. And again, we're just trying to kind of streamline a lot of different things, right? We talked about how instead of having specific functions for taxonomy and menus and users and nodes and stuff, we're going to basically everything is entityized. So the same is going to be true for the query. We want to just use entity query instead of entity field query. Wow, was that 30? Kind of didn't feel like it, right? I kind of ran through these pretty quickly. So what about functions that are completely removed? Did we kind of talk about things that just don't have a replacement? Let's talk about those. So your favorites. Drupal add JS, Drupal add CSS, and Drupal add library are all gone. There is no replacement function. Instead, what you're going to want to use is the attached property. And you can do this in Drupal 7. You probably should be doing this already in Drupal 7. When you're defining a block or defining a form, instead of using Drupal add JS, you're going to want to use the attached property. And if you want to kind of follow the discussion, the decision why, you can check out that specific node on Drupal.org. But a quick example, and this is actually taken from core. So when you want to add a particular library to a form, right, instead of doing Drupal add JS, Drupal add CSS, right, you would basically pass in this attached property and then define the various parts. So you'd have a library, and then you define the library here. You'd have your JavaScript, then you define the specific properties of how you want to load that JavaScript, whether it's a setting, what the data is, and then actually render the specific data itself, etc. So again, you can do this in Drupal 7. I highly encourage you guys to go ahead and do that in Drupal 7 and kind of get away from Drupal add CSS, Drupal add JS, etc., and basically load things using an attached key in your forms, in your blocks, in your things as you need it. So that you use it, you basically are loading those particular elements in the context that they're needed instead of every single time. All right, so let's kind of jump through these real quick, right? So we did strings. So those were kind of the first 4. Then we talked about Drupal render, right? Drupal load multiple, node view multiple kind of went away. We're kind of streamlining those with entity load and entity view multiple, respectively, right? We talked about how node underscore save is gone, hook underscore menu is gone, right? We're streamlining that into entity create. The routing files, the configuration files using YAML. Menu get item is gone. We're using request attributes. We still have some stuff that we can use, right, in that was in D7 that we can use in D8, the menu tree stuff, the taxonomy get tree stuff. But a lot of the field-specific procedural functions, taxonomy-specific procedural functions are gone in favor of kind of streamlined entity create functions, right? And the same is true for updating specific instances. We're going to use save methods instead. We talked about kind of the helper classes, the module handler classes, the alter methods, etc. for Git implementations, invoke all, etc. The hook form alters are still there, but instead of instead of entity field query, now we're just kind of doing a basic entity, regular entity query instead of entity field query. So technically, the ones that I showed you weren't completely 30, but if you consider the fact that I also told you that 3 were removed, that's actually more. So I did kind of fulfill my promise and say that, yeah, we did go through 30. And yeah, those are all pretty awesome. I'm really excited for Drupal 8. So what's next? What should you be doing next? So I would say definitely contribute to the examples module. I know there's some help there needed, right? That was one of the really cool things for me learning Drupal 7 a few years ago, kind of understanding, okay, how do we do certain things, forms, menus, Ajax examples. Definitely contribute there or look at there, if you're looking for something else to kind of look at. Read the docs, specifically to the API for Drupal 8, right? And then the other thing that I want to show you, and I probably need to refresh this, is check out the scaffolding module. So my good friend Jesus is really kind of working on a scaffolding module for Drupal, and this is borrowing from Symfony. So what this basically does is that you can essentially invoke a set of functions from programmatically, which will build out the folder that you need when you're building a particular module from start. So it's almost like a module starter. So whether you're building a custom module that's going to have menu functions, or whether you want to include certain things, a custom form, it will know and basically set up your folders and set up your files accordingly. This is a really cool way to kind of learn all the different pieces that are involved into what goes into building a Drupal 8 module. So let's get into the questions. And again, if you want to see these slides, that's the URL for those slides. If you want to contribute or fork these slides, they are on GitHub. They're open for everyone. So yeah, that's it. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Fred. That was great. Nice tie-in. Jesus just demonstrated the D8 module scaffolding module on my Drupal camp this week. So
excellent. So there you go.
if you go to my YouTube channel, the raw recording is there, and in a few weeks I will have cut that down and reposted it on acquia.com with a little more more compact and nice and whatever. But he gave a really, really hardcore, very interesting demo of how that goes. So very good tip indeed. This question, we have one question that's come up, and I've seen this a couple times this week. People seem a little confused as to whether hook menu is completely removed from D8 at this point or not. So the question is, last time I followed D8 module development, hook menu was still required, apart from the rooting YAML file. So what do you have to say about that? What's the...
I do not know. That's a great question. I remember when I did this presentation in New York, in NYC, XJM was in the room, and yeah, a lot of the why are we doing this, and I thought this was still their questions, she was able to kind of jump into. I'm not sure, again, from what I saw, and I'll try to find the specific change log and tweet it out, hook underscore menu, from the way I understand it, is going away. That the way you define your various routes, because the point of hook underscore menu was to define routes and set the configuration for a particular route, whether it's a permission, to the callback, to how the title is going to be done, that is all going to be in the routing .yaml file. So the fact that you would still invoke hook underscore menu is kind of news to me. So that's a great question. I'm not sure though.
Right now, somebody, I'm looking for it. Somebody mentioned this on one of my things this week. So I'm now desperately trying to find where that question was. Let's see. Nicola Page, I think, asked that or something very similar. Everybody out there in TV land, bear with us a second. No? Darn it. Here we go. Okay, so Lee Rowlands and Kim Pepper talked about Drupal 8 code, and
Okay.
let's see. And Nick LePage asked the question. Nick. But somehow I have the feeling he asked it on Facebook, which is why I'm scrolling desperately.
Okay.
Okay. Anybody know any good jokes? But I'm actually I would be keen to figure this out. So let's just. Have you got a second still?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. No. Ah. Was it this one? Oh, okay. Maybe it's.
Let me see if I can find it as well.
Yeah. It's definitely top of mind for a lot of people. So I would feel great if we could.
Here's the link that I'm referencing. I'll put this in. Should I put it in the chat? Where should I put it?
That's a Oh, you know what? Post it on the event page for this event, and then
Okay.
everyone.
Is that the Google Hangout link?
It's in fact. So if you go to, gosh, how do we post links in the Hangout? I guess if you go to my Google Plus page, and then events, then you'll find this running, and there's a comment stream. Otherwise, you know what? If you paste it to me in Skype or something, I can put it straight onto that page. I have it open.
Okay, I'll put it on the Google chat. There you go. That's the link that I'm referencing that talks about the removing of hook menu, and there's even a caveat that says in previous versions of Drupal 8, hook menu was still used to define menu links. This was changed. Refer to the corresponding change notes for more information. So,
okay, where did you? Now I can't find that.
okay.
Let's see. Paste it here. This is live and in Technicolor.
Okay. I'm looking for you.
Otherwise,
I just put it in the.
Oh, I see it now. Sorry. Ha ha ha.
That's right.
Okay. So attention, userland. Drupal.org/node/1800686, and I'm now putting that on the event page as well. So talking about hook menu, right? Q&A. Hook menu issues that.
It says, so right now it's a little bit confusing, and it also has a note that says this is quite possibly not the final answer. So
Okay.
It says hook_menu will remain in place where menu items are defined for the UI and where route names are registered for a URL path. The actual mappings between route names and the page and access callbacks are defined in a file called whatever module name.routing.yaml. Since the new routing system is in development, things that seem complicated and redundant are subject to further changes. So then there's another note that says, in previous versions, it was still being used, this was changed, etc. So
yeah, I have the strong impression that it was changed very, very recently and that it's out. But I can't find the source that I got that from. So, oh well. So Doug Van says, someone asked me if renderable arrays are still a mess. what should I tell them?
So I'm assuming, Doug, when you say a mess, you mean the fact that, I mean, that seems to be implying like, okay, arrays are very hard to deal with because you can pass pretty much anything to them. It's not really defined. And from what I can see right now, I definitely think that, yeah, they are still a little bit of a mess. And I think that, as I said in my presentation, I think it would definitely help in documentation world to kind of streamline and understand, what are the properties and keys that can be used inside of a render array. But yes, they are a little bit, they're still kind of, yeah, nested hell a little bit, but from my perspective, yeah.
So I want to attack this one first. What about having a library JS getting loaded for all of the pages instead of some specific form?
Right, so you would do that just like you would any other piece. You would define that library or that, JS in like you would a theme function. So if for instance, if you had a CSS file or JS file that needed to load in every page request, you define it in the info of that theme. But if you need to load a library specifically to a context of a block being rendered or a form being rendered, you would use the attached property.
Okay, cool. Now, Doug Van has one more question that I would like to start out addressing, and then feel free to jump in if you have anything to say about this. My biggest question is this: do we have any indication that this large volume of changes is drawing interest from new developers? We're targeting a very specific demographic with these changes. Do we know we're attracting that demographic? So, Doug, I want to break this down into at least a couple of points. The changes way down deep inside the code, like how Drupal is built under the hood, on the one hand, and the changes that they make to the visible, usable, clickable UI on the other hand, because I think there are two separate issues, and I think that Drupal has been changed significantly in Drupal 8 for different reasons for different audiences. So I don't think that we're just targeting one single demographic with everything that's gone into Drupal 8, especially everything that's, for example, flown out of the Spark project, and so content authors, editors, workflows, their day-to-day job should be easier to make easy because the user interface is so much better, because WYSIWYG's in core, because the demands that they have for their jobs have been addressed. So I think that we've made a much better experience, much easier to make for that target group. And for anyone administering a Drupal site, the fact that we've done things like build the entire admin interface out of views now gives us a completely customizable, configurable backend, which is an incredible win, because as long as you know how to configure a view, you can make your own backend for Drupal, and you can customize it. And that's something that used to be a really, really special hell, delivering projects and giving a backend that was actually really suited to whatever the purpose of that site was. And now I think we can do custom backends like we've never done before, and I find that amazing. About the changes under the hood, and I know that was, I believe that was your specific question. I've been talking with people like Sensio Labs UK and their parent company Invika, both publicly and in private. I met a ton of Symfony people in person in the last few months, and I've been talking with Symfony shops and mixed skill shops, and I've been told all sorts of very encouraging things. I was told by a guy whose business is doing integrations with complex legacy systems and e-commerce, and he has always done, I'm trying to think, and he's been sort of a pure PHP shop, and he told me very, very specifically that now that Drupal 8 includes the Symfony components and the compatibilities and the object orientation that it does, he is thrilled to never have to touch typo 3 again. Now that's just what he told me. And that he will, as soon as Drupal 8 is out, that is his CMS of choice, and Drupal's never been that before. I've also had people from the Symfony community tell me that Drupal is going to be their choice for managing content and for doing things that Drupal's already good at, dealing with access, the user roles, permissions, that sort of stuff. So they've got this very powerful CMS now that they can just turn to, and they can put it next to or integrated around their targeted, Slender, specific application that they're still going to build with Symfony. But the fact that they can look into Drupal and understand it now gives them incredible confidence to do integration projects now and to do special things with a sort of with a much bigger toolbox than they've had before. Time will tell, and there are people who feel that starting from zero and building everything up is more attractive to them than, you know, starting with the Drupal house and taking out the pieces until you have what you want. But I've had a lot of conversations that tell me that we are going to indeed have a much broader user base over time, developer base, and so on. Fred?
Oh, sorry. I didn't know. You said everything that needed to be said. I agree. I mean,
Okay.
I think the best answer was the fact, you know, like Jesus is, you know, a Symfony developer. He's coming over and he's building, you know, a scaffolding thing. I mean, that simple example, I think, you know, the answer to your question, Doug, is yes. I think we're attracting a demographic for sure. So.
Oh, that's true. Jesus told me that actually he messed around with Drupal a few years ago, but he was a pure Symfony guy until the Drupal 8 cycle got rolling, and then he got excited, and he's been doing all sorts of amazing stuff now on Drupal 8. It's true. That's a great case in point. So, Fredric, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and do this today. I will be posting it in the next few weeks, as I promised. In the meantime, the event page is available, the YouTube videos available in the raw, and I hope you're going to be in Austin. Are we going to see each other there?
I will be in Austin. Yes, I'll be there.
All right. Great. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
All right, take care, man. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.